All right, so I want to talk with you guys about some objections to moral arguments. So last time we looked at the structure of a moral argument, and today I want to talk about some common objections. So first, let's just get a moral argument here on the table. I'm going to give a structure of the probabilistic form. So you've got some moral data, like some experience of something good, or some principles of goodness or badness. Whatever this moral data is, the fact that there are moral beings, beings that have value, and we want to consider sort of what accounts for that data. So I've got my drawing pad here. Let's let this be the moral data, and then we can explain this in different ways. So we've got some hypothesis H1, and maybe that would be the hypothesis that everything's fundamentally mindless and material. Compare that with another hypothesis, H2. There is some foundational mind, and then we can consider how likely this moral data is on the different hypotheses. If this data is more likely on H2 than on H1, then this data will support H2 over H1. So I want to kind of give this argument to you in this general structure so you can fill in the H's and the M here in a way that makes sense to you. Think of, for example, the idea that there's this mindless molecules hitting each other, and then over time, this will produce complex creatures who can have moral experience, and maybe these things will even produce necessary moral principles. You can consider how likely that is or how expected that is. And then you could compare that with the idea that no, it's not that it's just completely mindless. This scribble, this represents something more profound, like there's maybe a personal foundation. Okay, so you can compare those, and so that's basically your argument. And what I want to do is I don't want to go further into the argument, except that what I really want to do is look at some possible objections as a way of kind of probing the concepts, helping us to think more about this. So one common objection people raise to moral arguments is an objection against the objectivity of morality. So maybe we can explain morality in terms of some sort of process, maybe an evolutionary process where the creatures that are surviving are the ones that are interested in their own survival. See that arrow? That represents him being interested in himself. He wants to survive. And the beings that are not interested in themselves, they're just sort of clueless beings. And they don't survive. They get eaten up by beasts. Those are teeth. Okay? And so they don't pass on their offspring. And the ones that pass on their offspring are ones that have an objective moral sense. But this objective moral sense, I didn't mean objective moral sense. They just have a moral sense, but doesn't actually track any kind of moral reality. And so that's it. We can explain morality purely in terms of this kind of biological evolution, the survival of the fittest. And so the entire argument falls away. I think you already kind of know what I'm going to say based on my previous discussion of moral arguments. What I'm going to say is that might target a certain moral argument that has as its moral data the objectivity of morality, but doesn't thereby target every form of the argument, because you could have a form of the argument that's based on your moral experience. How is it that there are beings that have this moral experience? And you might say, well, it's this evolutionary story. That's what explains how there are these beings that have moral experience. But there's this deeper problem, which is the problem, it's related to the hard problem of consciousness. So the evolutionary mechanisms might explain how you go from one state to another, but it doesn't explain how the moral sense ever enters in the first place. So to help you think about this, you can imagine an evolution of machines. That's a machine. These machines aren't conscious. And maybe the more complex ones survive, pass on their genes or whatever the more functional ones are, but doesn't thereby give you any kind of moral sense. And even if you get a conscious sense, that still doesn't give you a moral sense. Now, I want to be clear here. I'm not saying that this is an argument from probability. This isn't saying that it's impossible in principle to get the moral sense. Maybe it is impossible in principle. Maybe there's an in principle construction problem here. But there's the argument that I gave is a probability-based argument. Would you expect an evolutionary system to automatically, inevitably produce morally sensing beings? Now, I mean, I actually have some thoughts about this because I had a 2-year grant project where I created my own simulation of evolution, and I created a complex adaptive system where there were machine-like things that evolved over time, and none of them developed. They just changed from one shape to the next. It was interesting to watch the evolution of shapes, but the evolution of shapes didn't thereby give them an actual moral sense. It didn't give them any sense, really. Okay, so my point here is just that even if morality isn't objective, we can even put that to the side. We could argue that it is, we could consider reasons to think that it is, but you don't have to give an argument that it is to defend a moral argument, because you can have a moral argument based on moral sense. So that's what I want to say about that that objection. That isn't to say that this is all there is to say. Again, one has to consider all the different theories and weigh them. And my goal here is just to really help you to see that there are different versions of the argument. So this objection helps us separate one version from another. All right, another common objection to moral arguments is that they all sort of make morality arbitrary, because the idea here is that if you're saying that things are good because God says they're good, then it looks like God could just say that they're not good. He could say that killing people for fun is the right thing to do, and that it would be the right thing to do. And you might think that's not how morality actually is. You might have the sense that no, there's this actual rightness, and the rightness is more intrinsic to the action. It doesn't depend on whether any being says that it's right. Okay. Now, I'm not saying here that everything is like that. Maybe there are some things, like as a parent, I can make rules for my kids, and because if I love my kids and I have a wisdom for how to protect them, those rules have a kind of authority for them because it's there to serve them. And so you might say that there are some actions that are right because somebody in authority says that they're right. So we can leave that open. But are all actions like that? I mean, you might think that there are some actions that are just right, some actions that are just wrong. I mean, you might even think that like somebody in authority could say something wrong. They could abuse their authority. And just because, let's say, you have this sort of supreme authority, that doesn't mean that you can just make it the case that killing kids and torturing beings just for fun is right. That would make goodness arbitrary. Now, a response to this objection is really just to clarify that the moral argument doesn't require that all morality depends on what God says. So let's say this is the foundation of morality, and let's say this foundation has a moral nature that includes the necessary principles of justice and goodness, sort of bedrock principles of morality. And maybe this moral nature is actually built into this nature is built into a moral mind. It's a basic foundational mind. Here, the goodness isn't arbitrary. The principles of right and wrong aren't arbitrary. They're actually built into the fabric of this ground of existence. If this mind has necessary existence, then these things could have necessary existence as well. It could be necessarily true that killing kids for the fun of it is bad. And that truth may actually correspond to a reality, a moral reality, built into the necessary foundation of things. Okay, so the point here is that moral arguments don't have as their conclusion that God, not every moral argument is going to say, oh, therefore everything that's right or wrong depends on what God says, or what God wills, or what God decides. It could be that what God wills or decides and says is based in part on God's perfect nature. And that perfect nature isn't arbitrary because it exists in a necessary way. Couldn't have been otherwise. So I think this objection really helps to clarify different versions of the moral argument. It doesn't really touch the argument, the general structure of the argument. Objection 3 Justice and mercy, for example, are intrinsically good. They're good just in virtue of their natures, you might say, not in virtue of God's will or even God's nature. This is kind of a modified Euthyphro dilemma or objection. So the Euthyphro objection, going back to the previous slide, you could say, look, are things good just because God says they're good, or does God say they're good because they are good? You might say, in order for morality not to be arbitrary, some things just have to be good in sort of a basic way. Well, if you say that they're good because they're built into God's nature, okay, then you still have a dilemma here. I mean, are things good just because they're part of God's nature, or are they part of God's nature because they're good, because they're intrinsically good? So you might think that some things are just good sort of in their own right. Let me kind of draw this foundation. This is the foundation of reality, and here's the rest of reality. And this foundation has this moral nature. Now, my response to this objection is really just to clarify that it's not part of the theory that there's a foundational moral reality within moral nature, that the elements of this moral foundation aren't intrinsically good, or that they're good only in virtue of being part of the foundation. In fact, you might think it goes the other way. You might think that the foundation of reality is perfectly good precisely because it includes these basic principles of right and wrong, this basic moral nature. And this basic moral nature it holds its goodness in a basic way, not in virtue of anything else. It's sort of at the foundational level of things. Analogy that I've used sometimes is to think of a castle that has some pillars. It's a terrible drawing. No, this is a beautiful drawing. Beautiful. Look at that. See? There's the gate. These are the pillars. Okay, it's a castle. And there's somebody living there up in this area here. Okay. You might think this is a beautiful castle. Now, let's say these pillars represent moral principles. Now, you might wonder why these moral principles exist. Do they exist only in virtue of the castle existing? Well, that's a little bit weird, because if this castle were destroyed, you could destroy the rest of the castle and these pillars could still stand in their own right. They're pillars just in their own right. But you might think that these pillars are actually part of this castle. You might think the castle is so beautiful precisely because it includes these beautiful pillars. Again, it's not that these pillars are beautiful just because they're part of the castle, or that they exist just because they're part of the castle. They have sort of their own existence or their own nature. But they sort of help make up the castle. And the same way, you could think of the moral principles as helping to make up this beautiful nature, this perfect nature. Okay, and we can leave to the side other questions about whether this nature is sort of ultimately simple at its root, or whether it has many complex elements. These questions are really on the side of what I'm saying, because however you answer that question, the idea here is that this beautiful nature is beautiful just sort of intrinsically, not in virtue of anything, not even in virtue of being part of God. Part of what makes God so great is that it includes these basic elements of awesomeness. Okay, so you might have questions about that. Feel free to send me your questions, but I just want you to see here that there is this distinction that we can make. And I remember when I first heard of this kind of dilemma in graduate school, I thought, oh yeah, this is devastating. No moral arguments can really make sense. But then I started thinking more about God's nature, and I started thinking, okay, well, what's really the difference here between thinking of these principles as intrinsically good and outside God's nature versus intrinsically good and inside God's nature? In both cases, you don't have to say that they're not intrinsically good. In both cases, you can say the principles are intrinsically good. And in fact, having a moral nature here is a good way of explaining kind of the home for these principles. These principles sort of occupy this moral nature. You might even think that the very existence of intrinsically good moral principles is precisely what you'd expect if there's a perfect supreme nature. And so that this actually makes these principles probable. All right, this is a common objection I hear. People will say that there's all sorts of moral theories, contractarianism, consequentialism, virtue ethics, all sorts of moral reasoning that just doesn't mention God at all. And are you saying like all these secular moral theories are just false? Are you going to argue against all of them? It seems kind of ambitious. They're all false. And my response to this is to say, no, we're not going to argue that these are false. Instead, what we're doing is we're actually giving a deeper theory that would predict theories that don't explicitly reference God. You can think of the theory as kind of like your moral compass. It kind of tells you which way to go. It's your theory of the right and the wrong. But that doesn't explain why having a compass doesn't explain why there are any compasses. Maybe there's a deeper explanation. Maybe there's a mind, okay, that made this compass. Now, your theory of the compass doesn't have to make reference to the mind at all. You can have all sorts of knowledge of the compass without talking about the mind. But the very existence of the compass is still evidence for a mind if the compass is more probable on the mind hypothesis than on its negation. So I want to make sure it's really clear. You don't have to have a theory that makes reference to God for that very theory to be evidence for God, right? I mean, we talked about the fine-tuning of the universe. We talked about complex creatures. You can understand complex creatures. You can understand matter. See, that's matter right there. These pixels, the motion of these pixels, look at that. You can have a theory about my motions here without mentioning the mind behind these motions. I mean, look, this is so random. Why would anybody think there's a mind behind these motions? Okay, you don't see my mind. How do you even know there's a mind behind? Maybe this is all just randomness. Maybe there's no mind behind this at all. And then you see something that seems sort of striking. And that makes you think there's a mind. But still, you don't see the mind. All you see are just these red pixels here. So the point is, you don't have to mention the cause to understand the effect. You don't have to mention the cause to have an argument from the effect to the cause as the best explanation of that effect. Or, just to be clear, if we're talking about moral theories, and let's say some of these include necessary moral principles, just because the principles are necessary doesn't mean you can't have a theory that predicts those theories. So the theory that there's a supreme moral foundation makes probable, you might think, that there are necessary moral principles. And so you can have a theory of ultimate reality that makes this more probable, even if this theory here, moral theory, doesn't include God as part of it. Okay, so I hope that's helpful. This is just an introduction to some of the objections and some of the replies. And ultimately, what will help you the most is for me to interact with your questions and your objections and thoughts. So feel free to let me know your questions. Thank you, guys.